I am so excited to be here today with Dr. Ana Mozol. She's a core faculty member at the Adler University, or was, and an adjunct faculty member at Pacifica Graduate Institute for over 12 years. Courses she has taught focus on Jungian, psychoanalytic, and archetypal depth psychology, trauma, women's individuation, sexuality, shamanism, creativity, and dream work. Ana has studied with and been mentored by such distinguished elders in the field as James Hillman, Christine Downing, Jeff Rath, Gina Ogden, and Marion Woodman. She has a private practice in Vancouver, Canada, where she specializes in body-oriented depth analysis, dream work, and the intersection of depth psychology and the creative arts. She is a graduate of a 2-year full-time acting program based off Stanislavski's method and has acted in several professional theater shows. Well, it's amazing to have you here today. I have been eagerly awaiting this interview for a while now.
Thank you, Alexis. It's really lovely to be here with you today.
Yeah, so this book has meant so much to me. So as people who follow me and some clients that I work with know that Marion Woodman's work is very close to my own work, especially in terms of women and trauma. Recently did a workshop on Dancing in the Flames, and this book feels like the kind of graduation from that book. I used to say that Dancing in the Flames literally covers everything when it comes to the feminine, or at least the dark feminine coming to consciousness. And after reading this book, I have to say that it touches on, for me, everything. And it was very, had to go through it very slowly, like I was telling you earlier. So, I'm very excited to get into some of the details of this book and share them with people that have been having similar experiences or are interested in the topic of the dark feminine and how she shows up and what she works with archetypally. So first, like I said, I've yet to read another account of the descent to the goddess that so closely resonates with my own. Something so contemporary and relatable to modern women who have suffered sexual assault. To find it in depth psychology also has inspired me to lean into more of my own dissertation topic. I feel like this topic isn't spoken to enough. I'm wondering if you could relay some of your own experience in coming to this topic and also deciding to make it a memoir, because I feel like in the moment in the book when you speak to this, like you're lying in bed and you wake up after a dream and you feel this sense of a calling to this topic. This was so similar to me that said, just a voice inside that said, like, you have to write about this. It's not been written about clearly enough. And to take it from a personal, perspective, from a memoir, like that's very hard to do. So I'm curious what that was like for you.
Well, thank you, Alexis. It's really nice to hear that the book inspired you and resonates with you to the degree that it's kind of supportive in helping you lean into the topic that you're called to do. That's just so lovely for me to hear. This topic, it came to me in so many different ways. I mean, first of all, I noticed it's always been the women in depth psychology that have risked sharing and kind of situating themselves in their own life experience, kind of in the center of their research, that speak to me the most. And I think what I did with this book is I kind of took it further than I'd seen anyone else take it. So I almost see this as being half memoir, half depth psychological research. It really intertwines these two in a way that I hadn't seen it before. But that's what felt true to me, and I had a dream when I was in graduate school. And in that dream, I was at a conference, a depth psychology conference, and I stood up to the podium to give a lecture. And as I started speaking, everything that came out of my mouth was nothing that I had planned to say. It was all different, but it was coming from such a place so deep inside of me. And as I spoke, this mandala opened up behind me and it started coming alive, and it was like breathing. And it was like all of these different colors shape-shifted. And I feel like that image, that dream, represents the exact process of writing this book. I thought it was going to be so many things, and then it would take a shift and it would take a turn, or I would have another dream. I would be led in a different direction, and I just kept following it. So it really literally became something entirely other 2 or 3 times, maybe even 4, while I was writing it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love that about the book, that you do include so many of your personal dreams, and your dream journal in the book, to follow kind of the phenomenon that's happening for you
Mm.
throughout this process, and that it was so personal. And I related so much to it, and to think about the images that came up for you and what I want to focus on in terms of soul, and how soul speaks to those images or
Mm.
embodies those symptoms in the dream, and is kind of telling us how she wants to be cared for and tended to. And
Very Mhm.
I remember in the book when you decided, to write about this topic for your dissertation, and you were encountering aspects of the demon lover in your dreams, and there's a sense of like the repetition compulsion that we all play out in our own ways, and going through that and deciding, I've realized in this dream how to stop the pattern, or how
Mhm.
to move through the repetition, and that writing this was a part of that process for you.
Yeah, writing it was absolutely a process. And there was one particular dream that came through that I do speak about in the book. But when it did, I just knew I was being asked to write this. And at the time, I honestly did not feel strong enough to do it. I did not want to do it. But I think that's the magic and that's the alchemy of writing, you know? As I wrote and as I, to use your word, leaned into it changed me. And by the time I was actually finished, I did feel comfortable to put it out there. And I was strong. So, yeah.
Well, that gives me a lot of hope for my own process. And anyone knows going into it is definitely its own descent. And when the synchronicities start happening, it can really take you for a ride, like any good story does.
Mhm.
Uh, in the book, you write explicitly about your encounter with this demon lover archetype, and how, which is basically the animus in his, symptomatic presentation, and has many different interesting things that he does to interact with the dream ego, and depending on where we are at in our work. And for folks that are not new to the concept of the dark feminine, and know that this is a part of her archetypal process. Um, and you speak to it in some ways in the book as an unrealized or unconscious Dionysus. This is a process that can be tough to understand for people that haven't encountered it, but especially when it is showing up in dreams, and calling us inward.
Mhm.
And many of my clients are at this point in some of their work, and really perplexed by this archetype. But can you explain to the listeners the archetype of the daemon, or the demon lover, and kind of the it's hard to articulate, but in a way that maybe they could understand.
Sure. I'll do my best. It's a very complicated concept. But what I would say is how I define it is that it's an autonomous, split off complex that takes possession of the ego, you know? And in that way, it has its own kind of sense of identity, its own goal, its own teleological function, which is a destructive one, which is something that is ruled by the death instinct. So it leads somebody farther and farther away from their own true path, you know? And that's why the engagement with it is so important. I think the demon lover archetype can manifest in 3 ways. It can manifest in relation to explicit trauma, like a sexual assault or a rape, as we've talked about. It can manifest also just from trauma that's passed down from previous generations that was never processed or integrated. I've seen that a lot in my practice.
Mhm.
And I think just living in this world the way it is right now, where the rape of the feminine is such a reality, it manifests just in relation to implicit social conditioning. So I truly believe, and I have not worked with anyone to this date, without enough analytical or dream work, this archetype does get uncovered at some point. And a lot of women are really uncomfortable to talk about these dreams. So sometimes it even takes a year to a year and a half for them to risk speaking about it because there's so much shame around it. It's enshrouded. There's an erotic sexual charge with it that's hard to understand and make sense of. Yeah, so and this idea of the demon daemon, like I mean that's really important too, right? Because it starts off from this place, and in psychoanalytic language, we could say it's like an identification with the aggressor, you know? So it's like the trauma taking hold of the individual and then just living it out endlessly in the repetition compulsion at different levels of subtlety, right? I lost my train of thought there. Yes. So the negative animus, I mean, the deep work in analysis and dream work is to transform that negative animus into the positive, guiding, protective force, spiritual force that supports a woman on her journey towards individuation. And, you know, that is, those phases are described in the book, 9 phases of breaking the complex and opening to that.
Yeah, and I think that is, you know, amongst many things in the book, one of the reasons that it just has become invaluable to me in my process, and I think would be for anybody else, but that you explicate the stages, that you can feel through them and had them so well documented in that way that it just, you know, really made it make way more sense, and because it can be quite a chaotic experience at times in the dream work at least, and to see it play out and to see your kind of movement towards the different you know, healthy positive animus figure that can show up in a certain kind of way. And we see that kind of, I think, you know, parallels within and without in so many different ways that we work through this type of demon lover archetype in the masculine.
Yeah, I think we're actually going through that process in the collective. You know,
Yeah.
a lot of women are doing it individually, but the collective is evolving through this as well. In the early stages, I'd say stage 1 or 2 is where we are.
Yeah. And I think that's why it also makes sense. I mean, this, you know, dark feminine rising, right? The aspect of the title of the book. Actually, usually I show the book, so I'll just hold it up here because we're kind of right in the middle here. It's a revisioning to love, dark feminine rising. And thinking about that energy, it's rising as we're also working on this this demon lover archetype at the same time to watch that play out. So in terms of kind of working with this figure, I mean, following the dreams, of course, really dedicating oneself to their dream work, and dreaming the dream onward when it comes to working with the animus and working with the demon lover, and really building that relationship with him to work through the symptoms. How does one work with this archetype safely? What would you suggest?
Well, I think the safest is in the active imagination. It is in the inner realm. Because if it isn't worked within the inner realm, it tends to constellate externally in relationships. So just like you said, active imagination is number 1. There can be a huge feeling of an obstacle to doing that kind of active imagination, though, because how this archetype is showing up in the dreams often so mirrors, almost identically, the perpetrator if there was a trauma, right? So to be able to look at that figure as an inner figure rather than as merely a representation of somebody that did something violating to that individual, that's a really hard, different, and important differentiation to make because it is internalized now and it's not that. It's something different, you know? And it does connect and it does hold the keys to the individuation process.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned something, it's a bit paradoxical, that like if it's out there, then it's showing up differently internally. And if we can bring it internally, like von Franz says, to pull the projection inward and take it off of the archetype, that's the kind of like, digesting we're doing with the dream image, to hold that and heal it within. But it can be very hard, in the number of women I've encountered that, it does take some level of that repetition out in the world for it to really be worked through and realized. And that, as painful as that can be, I think some part of that projection process is useful in the beginning, or has information for us.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes almost necessary to see it out there even before somebody can see it and start to work with it inside. And like Marion Woodman used to say, that pulling back of projections is a huge part of the work. That work is actual agony. To see that it's actually inside, that this energy, this archetype, this destructive side is happening internally as well as externally.
Yeah. Woodman, at one point, I think she said, we either go consciously or we get dragged like a pig to slaughter.
Most get dragged. There's very few that actually walk consciously. And it's going to you repeat it enough times in relationship, and it's just like, okay, this has to stop. How does this stop? Yeah.
And so would you say, just kind of, when it comes to the dream image, giving it that attention, as hard as it can be, just like being able to receive it and hold space for it in active imagination?
In active imagination and the dialogue back and forth, that really, allows the transformation to start to happen, because different elements of the archetype are revealed, like the protective element, which is there and is real. That archetype doesn't want to move and doesn't want to evolve, because in some ways it feels like it's being protected, and protecting from the intensity of going into the trauma.
Yeah. It can be hard to discern that. I mean, in that affect and the communication of the image or the archetype. It reminds me of Cal Shed's work, when Cal Shed talks about the protector saboteur. Your approach is a little bit different, which I actually love and like about the book, but you definitely do mention that there is still a part of him that, he pops up around the trauma itself. Even it could be even earlier trauma than we think about when we think about maybe our main trauma. But he shows up as that protector, and that at some point now as adults, he's not really protecting anymore. He's more at that. He's still in that puer, at that age when the trauma happened.
Yes, that's true.
So you have this kind of deeply moving mythopoetic way of explicating the necessity of what I call leaning in, or as you call it, embracing the mystery. And it's hard to kind of articulate to people listening what this feels like in the book. That it's like, finally I encountered a book where somebody who is a professional is also leaning into it just fully with their full self. And we say that in the field, but I think when it comes to this archetype, to really read it, it was so containing and encouraging. What does this look like for you? What does it feel like to embrace the mystery?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think because when you're embracing the mystery, you're embracing the unconscious, you're inviting and invoking it into your life, So it feels a little crazy, and it feels like it borders back and forth between, oh my God, I'm insane for thinking of doing this or wanting to do this, and then feeling like, oh, brave and encouraged. And it's this flip-flopping back and forth to feeling like you're on the path to, oh my gosh, there's no path, right? Because it really, truly is walking into the unknown, right? It's leaving behind structures that are familiar and have represented safety and familiarity in the known world. And it's risking something that's coming from, either a felt sense or a dream. For me, even after so many years of teaching, I had one particular dream where I entered this magical kind of mystical snowy landscape, and there were two institutes there, right? And one was the Institute of the Good Psychologists, and one was the Institute of the Bad Psychologists. And I kind of thought of this as the two institutes that I was teaching at, because one was more steeped in depth psychology and the other wasn't. So I felt a little bit more like an alien teaching at this other one where nobody else was really practicing depth psychology.
Hmm.
And in this, there was a conference going on, and they were like, "Oh, come on in. You know, we really you belong here. We really want you to be here." But in the dream, I felt such a strong pull to this path that was going deeper into the forest, deeper into the unknown. And as I started walking it and letting myself walk it, I just had the feeling, I just had the knowing, like dreams can always just bring in that knowing. I wasn't going to go back to either, because I had been kind of deciding where I wanted to situate myself. Was it more with Pacifica? Was it more with Adler? Was it, you know, there was this back and forth, and dreams can be pretty funny with this trickster energy, the good, the bad, you know? But it was like holding the tension of the opposites, and it took me somewhere else. That's kind of the path I'm on now. It's the unknown path.
Right. That third thing that, you know, we hold that tension, we can bring in that complexity.
Exactly.
Meet with.
Function. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a lot of people that I have, you know, people are always asking me, how do I go deeper? How do I, you know, sit with this process? And they're always kind of right at the edge. A lot of dreams of, you know, going over the edge and the fear of the unknown in that way. So it can definitely be an intense process, and that feeling of, oh, well, this doesn't seem sane for me to do this.
Yeah. That's
Is
when you know you're on the right track. Yeah. Yeah.
definitely real, and definitely, you know, and that's why they say this type of work requires a lot of other types of cognitive work maybe before we get into it, to get grounded and centered enough to handle more depth work. But when we say depth, this is what it means to go deep, and to be able to be there with yourself, and to really, you know, for me, leaning in means like letting it all happen.
Yes.
There's love, if there's rage, you know, you let yourself feel all of that, and not tell yourself that you shouldn't be feeling A, B, or C.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Especially when you're building that relationship, personifying the images, it really has to be real.
Yeah, and there does have to be a strong sense of self moving into the work to
Mhm.
kind of bear and tolerate and contain the dysregulation that can happen in, you know, walking through and into the unknown. Yeah.
Yeah. There
Agreed.
was there's this speaking to that kind of third thing and like leaning in. One of my favorite quotes that you used of Woodman in personal communication with her was that if one stays at the edge of the abyss long enough, the confusion and chaos will transform into a brilliant star. And we kind of get this more dynamic version of holding the opposites in that statement, and
Mm-hmm.
the emergence that can come from bearing that.
Yeah, and staying in the negative capacity, staying in the unknown as long as you absolutely can, you know, requires faith, it requires courage. But yeah, that's such a beautiful thing. I do love what she said there, because something is forming, and it is your brilliance that's forming.
Mhm. Yes. Well, reading your, you know, respects as well as critical thoughts on elder analysts. I mean, they come up a lot, and you know, Woodman, of course, and others who have approached the animus in their time, which was such a breath of fresh air for me. And I've always, you know, very much admired them and incorporated them in my work. But how can women today consider the daemon in terms of, like, I guess when we talked about this a little bit, like, what is the collective experiencing now, and how is animus work different in a post-Jungian world than it was when we were first kind of discovering and writing about it?
I think it's always been a little bit different, and it's been evolving over time. But one of the primary things that I'm seeing now is something that Hillman started in his thinking of anima and animus, that they're both together, that we have both inside of our psyches. And I think this evolution of the idea of what is feminine and what is masculine is really starting to shift and is really starting to be questioned and is really starting to be taken out of these traditional gender roles the way we've known them. And I think that's very exciting work, and I think the engaging with it from a very personal, very unique place, and it is also extremely interesting to me, because I do think, yes, there's some things like the phases that I go through and everything that touches, I think, on everyone's journey, but there's also places that are unique to each individual, how they experience the animals. And that is the area that I find fascinating.
Yes. And that they're both. I mean, it's really refreshing to hear you say that so explicitly, that there's both within us and we experience both in that way, just the same. And I was talking to Downing just a few weeks ago. We were talking about how Jung got the animus wrong. And I love it when she says that, and how she so talks about it, like, with such energy. And in part, yeah, I definitely see that. And now we have all these experiences of professionals with the animus, women who have encountered the animus and worked with the animus, where we didn't have that before, when he was considering, what is this that's showing up? And so in that way, transforming the discipline and being able to, there's so much more work left to do, but be able to bring that to the table. And your book is certainly a part of that.
Well, readers that are interested, Claire Douglas has this wonderful book where she really outlines all the different women's research on the animus over time in her book, The Woman in the Mirror. So for anyone who's interested in looking into that deeper.
Yeah, great suggestion. I think it's really important. And what I find out there on the internet, and people that are very much interested, they can understand that something's going on for them, and they get connected to Jung's work, to just hold their, suspended opinion, or their, their consciousness in suspension, and continue to kind of explore where the discipline is at now, and where we're working with these opposites and how we work with them, because it can, be very dangerous in some of these more literalized spaces.
Yes, that's very true.
So
very defining, very narrowing, right?
And almost like, in a way, repeating, the wound, and then recreating, the constructs that actually Jungian psychology, attempts to transcend and heal. So I find that very fascinating, that is happening, but also sad. So it's important to do one's own discerning in this space. So a big synchronicity for me in reading the book was when you quoted Robert Graves from Mammon and the Black Goddess. And in my working with actually Woodman and the Dancing in the Flames, and the Black Goddess, or the Black Madonna, encountered his book. And, again, another man talking about a phenomenon or an archetype that hasn't been that well documented in the experience of women, but nonetheless it does exist. And so in some ways, the way he worded it, of course, was something that I didn't care for. But I remember being in the depths, like the deepest throes with the Dark Goddess in my process, where the deepest love and resonance was occurring, and I decided to read him. But your kind of even-hearted critique of his encouragement to yet, still reject the serpent love, healed something in me. Like, he was mentioning, like, we should, encounter the snake in the dream, and we should conquer it, of course. And that is so common in early hero work, and people who are drawn to Campbell, and the men's movement too. So there's something very sensitive there, and you kind of immediately counter that. Can you speak more to this serpent love, and how we know now that we can work with it in a more facilitative way?
Yeah, sure. Well, what really moved me about that quote when I read it is, like, here is a man who understands that the way towards evolution between men and women, and between the masculine and feminine, is through this dark archetypal goddess energy, right? And he explains that and he expresses it and articulates it very beautifully. And then he goes on in the next sentence to say, but of course we have to reject serpent love.
Yeah.
What? How are you putting those two things together? Because for me, decidedly, the heart of this dark feminine rising energy is erotic, and it is erotic potential. You know, now this is something that Freud goes into and does very well, and something that Jung doesn't and didn't in his writing. You know, and I think that played out in his problems with the anima and and the women in his life, right? But for Freud, and as Chris Downing says, you know, what he gave us was this mythology of sexuality, you know, that the libido is central to the process, you know, whether it's supplemented, whether it's literalized, however it is. And then if we look back into like the traditional shamanic cultures and things like that, this idea of the erotic was particularly important, especially with women shamans. You know, it was actually the thing that did the healing. You know? And Barbara Tedlock's book, The Woman in the Shaman's Body, she talks about this, how it's like lightning in the body, you know? And I think it's one of the things that's so hard to hold and so hard to embrace for the depth of the power that it has, that most people reject it. Like Jung did, you know, in his rejection of the archetype of Salome, who represents a lot of this stuff, like, you know, Robert Graves did in that statement there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And there in the book you go through, you know, a lot of dreams that focus on this serpent and the way that it shows up. And I think in other people's visionary accounts in their dream work that have been published, I've encountered the same thing. And a lot of my clients, I'll have women show up and they'll say, I've been having dreams of these snakes, or I've been having reoccurring dreams of this one big snake. And they're always kind of wanting to know the deeper mystery of it. And it is multi-layered and complex, but it is definitely erotic. And I'm curious, like, in terms of, you know, the evolution, like, could you maybe explicate, like,
this snake, it used to be one of the deepest, most sacred symbols of the feminine. You know, you see some of the Greek goddess statues where they're holding the two snakes, or even back in Egypt, in ancient Egypt, the symbol, the hieroglyph for goddess was actually the cobra, right? So there was this identification of the deep feminine, the sacred feminine with the serpent. And then you see over time, like even in the temple of Apollo, this kind of taking over the masculine archetypes, the masculine mythologies, taking over the sacred feminine symbol for their own and trying to hold it, trying to control it. We see this in the caduceus, you know, which is the symbol for medicine. But originally, it's feminine.
yeah.
And I think women are uncovering that in their dreams, you know. And when the fear of the serpent starts to turn to a curiosity, and then you know, embracing of that, that's where you see really wonderful shifts starting to take place.
Yeah, and I think the shedding of the snake, you know, and encountering the snake as an image is really, like you say in the book, a lot of about shedding that conditioning, shedding the conditioning of not just only the symbol itself related to the feminine, but also shedding that conditioning in relation to our own sexuality and how we body forth as, you know, female animals and what that feels like to encounter that and integrate that. And I think the conditioning, you know, when we think of the snake being in the Garden of Eden, that it was deemed, you know, it has been deemed in our collective unconscious as this, you know, a sign of evil.
Yes, yes. To hold and have consciousness and knowledge of good and evil, you know.
Yeah.
Good and evil. So it's like the consciousness itself almost that's been.
And it's fascinating to work with people with their images around the snake and of course my own personal images as well. I had a very synchronistic dream while reading the book.
Oh.
And I hadn't gotten to the part where you talk about the cobra. and I had already had a dream where I was becoming, this cobra, and I felt the fan of the cobra head, and like different aspects of the cobra body. And then I read later on, like months later, the part where you speak to that, and I was just blown away. I don't have any words for it, but it was
Yeah.
definitely, you can feel this kind of energetic power, and to speak about, talk about leaning in, like really to feel that is where we want to go with the feminine, to help her feel into her power that way. But a lot of people, even if they understand the unconscious underpinnings of the snake, still have great, great resistance to the image of all images, I think.
I think that that's true. And I've actually never worked with anyone in my practice who, when that image, particularly of the cobra, appears, didn't have enormous transformation in their life and change in their life, pretty much right on the other side.
Yeah, it's been an intense year for me.
I can imagine it has.
So speaking of these snake goddesses that hold snakes, my patron goddess, as people know from my dissertation, Hecate, also holds a snake and is considered a dark goddess. But so I have this, quoted here: when someone has been traumatized, it is not images of light that heal, but images of dark. And I pulled that from the book because that was just, my whole body was like, yes, that's the focus of my dissertation, to consider, what are these dark images that are trying to facilitate this work, trying to facilitate the transformation, trying to speak to us about ourselves, really. And that they're not going to come in as, these light-bearing images that are going to save us, that it's really calling us to come to them, to meet with them internally. But this quote nearly tossed me across the room, so I hadn't read it in the same way from other people before. But I had never felt so seen by this book in terms of that. But like I said, my dissertation is on Hecate, but more specifically on the dark images of soul's discontent, and how the Dark Mother uses these images to speak to us, to get seen, and, as Giekrich would say, appreciated or perceived. Can you share with our listeners your experience of this with the Dark Mother, or your kind of maybe your dream experiences, or how she showed up for you? I know it's kind of hard to articulate.
Yeah, I can share a little bit. I mean, I do really agree. Like, it's interesting that you chose that quote and brought it back. It's nice to actually hear it, because I feel that when somebody really has gone through such a horrific experience as trauma does take people through, like into the depths of the underworld, the images of the light and healing and visualization and do that, all they do is they act to further leave that individual who already feels completely separate from community to feel even more alienated and more left out. And it is these darker images that at least have a resonance and have an understanding that mirrors their own internal experience of the world. That's where the healing starts. It's through that empathetic resonance, not through trying to skip over it and be somewhere else.
Yeah.
So,
and in the book, you speak to, similarly, touching on in many different areas that kind of corroborate my own inklings or my own feelings towards this topic, which I will probably be quoting you a lot. But there's a part where you talk about how this image really does hold and contain in the unconscious, in its own way, these feelings of oppression and marginalization that are kind of, I think, epigenetic in many ways, but also connected to our own very personally, and to look at that, for the primordial aspects of the feminine, but also for the feminine in ourselves, or soul at least, and that she is rising because the shadows are, in a way, being worked through or being held or being looked at now. We can feel that in the collective.
yeah, and an example personally that you had asked for me was when I did start my graduate school. It was actually just on the edge before I started, before I knew much about mythology, very little, maybe not even much at all about the Demeter Persephone myth. I had this dream where she appeared to me. And it was different from any dream I've ever had in the way that, in dreams, and it is hard to talk about, right? Because it's an extremely sacred experience, but it's also numinous in the way that Rudolf Otto talks about numinous. It's awful and it's terrifying. Like, I was up the rest of the night kind of shivering because it was so intense and it was impossible to hold. It was impossible to even understand what had happened. It just broke everything that I had ever thought about reality, and she appeared to me, like she came from that world into my world, and while I've had sacred dreams before, it's always been me in dream time or me crossing over into a sphere. It's never been that energy coming to me. And it was and is a guiding force for the work, for the book, and for my life. And I think it's a dream image that I will be unpacking for the rest of my life in different ways.
Yes. And I have similar feelings, I think. And to hear also, moments in the book for you that were just kind of very visceral in that same way, sacred, but just, really moving. You really let it move you. And I resonate with that and really, really admire that. To really feel it all the way through and to share that at the same time in the book. But I had, in reading Salome, the final chapter, reading about her who I've always really had a love for, and your work in the theater, and working with dreams in a similar way. I found that to be, especially inspiring, but it makes sense, that you have that kind of part of you that is maybe sensing or able to get into acting and theater work where you can hold this in a particular way and work through things creatively. I have a number of people that are also actors or actresses that I think this type of lens and knowing that about you would be so helpful in their process. So tell me a little bit about your involvement in the theater and how that has really kind of come into kind of overlap with your work and the work that you're doing now.
Mm-hmm. Well, my work in the theater that I've done in the past has, been some of the most significant stuff that I've ever done. And I've almost equated with my 3 degrees, the different, 3 particular theater performances that I did, with Salome being the PhD. It was just like, it was enormous. And the reasons that I felt called to play Salome and go, and the amount of synchronicities that surrounded it were just like the world was just speaking from all different places. And it really brought me back to life, And she meant so many different things to me. She represented this dark feminine energy that was trying to exist, this erotic potential trying to exist, but not really having a place for it in Herod's kingdom. Her ability to say, I would rather die than be violated. That kind of power, that kind of strength, and also her, aggressive sexuality too, and her violence that she holds herself, her own dark thoughts that she didn't feel. I mean, she's just such a complicated character, and she holds so many of these elements that we tend to reject, as a society and as women. So, and working with her was really part of healing from the betrayal of a relationship that had just ended for me. And it was a place for me to put all of that energy in a way that was healthy and ritualized and not going to harm anyone, hopefully, And it was just like really my internal work. So, and because it was so much, I started bringing it into my own work. And, that's the DreamWork theater that I do, which is kind of like partly mythodrama, it's partly psychodrama, which I have some training in, it's partly the theater. But I would say the core of it is active imagination. And it's the fourth phase of active imagination. It's ritual. Mm-hmm. So participants come and they bring their dreams, and we work them in community, and we kind of find the essence of it and we play it out. And sometimes that playing out can be collective stuff like scripts. Like I've even worked with Salome with groups before and like dreamed that script forward.
Wow.
For some of it, and different myths as well. So of course with COVID, nothing's really happening right now, but I'm actually working on a one-woman show around the Salome theme right now, and being able to show and express through the theater what I wasn't able to do in that theater production.
Yeah. Fascinating. And to, ritualizing and like, the acting out in a way, but in a safe container. I mean, really being able to put on the archetype and then kind of take it off at the same time. How transformative that can be, and also came through in this chapter in the book. So to be able to do that in a group setting, and to be with somebody who is so close to the experience yourself, and feel safe doing it, I'm sure is big work. And people can do it on Zoom. I have a lot of
I haven't gone there yet. But I suppose it's possible. Mm-hmm.
I hear people in their acting classes doing their acting classes on Zoom, and as kind of weird as that sounds, it sounds like you've still been able to do it and find a way. I just literally yesterday watched a play that they recited on Zoom. It's kind of just like doing a reading, but they're still acting, because we can't support the theater, during COVID. So it's important to find other ways.
That's so true. That's so true. Yeah.
Well, I hope people can hop over to your website and check out, what work you're doing now, and see how they can get involved in the Dream Theater work. Because I think that is so important to be able to really, let yourself go into the archetype, but make sure that it's safe and contained, and that you can build that relationship. Well,
for anyone who's interested, I do have a couple of online courses that are on my website that are easy to access, that go into this material as kind of a preparatory way. I have one course on dream work, and the other course is on the depth psychology of love. And the depth psychology of love obviously goes into a lot of the themes of the book that takes it further.
Yes. So definitely, you want to tell them your website?
Yeah, it's dreamworktheater.com or anamozol.com. Either one will take you directly to it. If anyone wants further information, they can reach me at anna@dreamworktheater.com or info@dreamworktheater.com. Thanks.
Perfect. So I'm just going to show the book here again. It's a Revisioning to Love, Dark Feminine Rising. It's absolutely amazing. Out of all the books that I've read, it's definitely in my top 5. And it was such a joy and a blessing to get to talk to you today and share my experience and my thoughts with you about the book, but to also bring this really valuable information to the folks that listen.
Thank you so much, Alexis. I really appreciate all of your feedback on the book, and just your careful inquiry and the questions that you have asked, which I feel are very relevant and have again brought the material alive for me in a way that's important at an important moment. So
wow.
I wish you all the best on your dissertation. I really look forward to seeing what will come of this, because you are on that path. You are embracing the mystery, and I encourage you to keep doing it. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. That means so much to me.